Have you ever wondered why, despite your best efforts, happiness seems to slip through your fingers like sand? Why just when life begins to feel good, something inside you seems to sabotage your joy, pulling you back into familiar patterns of struggle and discontent? Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who revolutionized our understanding of the human psyche, discovered something both unsettling and profound. Within each of us lives a hidden saboteur, a part of our personality that Jung called the shadow. This shadow doesn't want you to fail because it's evil, but because it's terrified of what your happiness might mean for its survival. What you're about to discover in the next few minutes will fundamentally change how you understand your own mind and why your path to lasting happiness has felt so elusive. We'll explore the 7 most common ways your shadow sabotages your happiness, the psychological mechanisms behind this self-destruction, and most importantly, how to transform this inner adversary into your greatest ally. By the end of this journey, you'll possess the tools to recognize when your shadow is at work and the wisdom to integrate it consciously, allowing you to finally step into the sustained joy and fulfillment that has always been your birthright. Jung spent decades studying the human psyche, and what he found was both fascinating and disturbing. He discovered that we all carry within us a psychological shadow, a repository of everything we've rejected, denied, or pushed away about ourselves. This isn't just our bad qualities, but any aspect of our personality that we've learned to hide or suppress. The shadow forms in childhood as we learn what parts of ourselves are acceptable to our family, culture, and society, and which parts must be hidden away to ensure our survival and belonging. The first way your shadow sabotages your happiness is through what Jung called the happiness ceiling. Imagine Sarah, a successful marketing executive who worked tirelessly for years to build her career. Every time she achieved a major milestone, promoted to a new position, or received recognition, something strange would happen. Within weeks of her success, she would unconsciously begin to make mistakes, miss important deadlines, or create conflicts with colleagues. She couldn't understand why she kept undermining herself just when things were going well. This pattern reveals a core shadow belief that Sarah wasn't consciously aware of. I don't deserve sustained happiness. This belief likely formed in her childhood, perhaps from parents who struggled financially and unconsciously taught her that success and joy were temporary luxuries that inevitably led to disappointment. Her shadow, in its misguided attempt to protect her from the pain of losing good things, would sabotage them before they could be taken away. The psychological mechanism here is profound. The shadow operates on the principle that it's safer to create familiar pain than to risk unfamiliar joy. Your unconscious mind has catalogued every moment of disappointment, every time happiness was followed by loss, and it creates a protective strategy. Maintain an emotional baseline that feels safe, even if that baseline is suffering. When you rise above this invisible ceiling, your shadow activates like an alarm system, generating self-sabotaging behaviors, negative thoughts, or destructive impulses to bring you back to familiar territory. The spiritual consequence of this pattern is that you remain trapped in what Jung called the provisional life, always waiting for permission to be truly happy, always finding reasons why now isn't the right time for joy. You become a spectator to your own existence, watching opportunities for fulfillment pass by, while some invisible force keeps you locked in patterns of struggle. The second way your shadow sabotages happiness is through projection, where we unconsciously attribute our disowned qualities to others and then attack them for it. Consider Michael, who grew up in a household where expressing joy or excitement was met with criticism. His father, a serious man who believed that happiness made people weak and irresponsible, would quickly shut down any displays of enthusiasm. As an adult, Michael found himself consistently irritated by people who seemed genuinely happy or optimistic. Without realizing it, Michael was projecting his own suppressed capacity for joy onto others, and then judging them for the very quality he most needed to reclaim within himself. Every time he encountered someone living with genuine happiness, his shadow would whisper criticisms. They're naive, they don't understand how hard life really is, their happiness is fake. By attacking happiness in others, his shadow ensured that Michael would never give himself permission to access that same joy within himself. Jung understood that what we cannot accept in ourselves, we will unconsciously seek to destroy in others. This creates a vicious cycle where your shadow not only prevents you from experiencing happiness, but actively works to eliminate it from your environment. You might find yourself drawn to negative news, pessimistic people, or situations that confirm your shadow's belief that sustained happiness is impossible or dangerous. The deeper psychological truth here is that projection serves as a defense mechanism against integration. Your shadow would rather maintain the familiar identity of someone who doesn't get to be happy than face the terrifying prospect of change. Happiness represents unknown territory, and the shadow, despite its destructive tendencies, feels safer with known suffering than unknown joy. The spiritual cost of this projection is profound isolation. When you're unconsciously attacking the very quality you most need to develop, you push away the people and experiences that could teach you how to access lasting fulfillment. You become surrounded by others who share your limitations, creating an echo chamber that reinforces the shadow's conviction that happiness is either impossible or inappropriate. The third form of shadow sabotage operates through what Jung called compensation, where extreme behaviors in one direction create an unconscious swing toward the opposite extreme. Picture David, a man who spent years cultivating a persona of being perpetually positive and upbeat. He became known among friends and colleagues as someone who never complained, always looked on the bright side, and maintained an unwavering optimistic outlook regardless of circumstances. But Jung taught us that the psyche always seeks balance. David's relentless positivity was actually his shadow's way of compensating for a deep terror of his own darkness, sadness, and anger. By refusing to acknowledge the full spectrum of human emotion, David created an internal pressure cooker. His happiness wasn't genuine. It was a performance designed to keep his shadow at bay. Inevitably, this artificial happiness would collapse under its own weight. David would experience sudden episodes of deep depression, inexplicable rage, or complete emotional numbness. These weren't random occurrences, but his shadow's attempt to restore psychological balance. The more fiercely he tried to maintain his positive persona, the more violently his shadow would eventually assert itself, destroying any authentic happiness he might have built. This reveals a crucial understanding about the nature of sustainable happiness. True joy isn't the absence of darkness, but the conscious integration of your full emotional spectrum. When you try to amputate parts of your humanity in pursuit of happiness, you create what Jung called a one-sided development that inevitably leads to its own destruction. The psychological mechanism here operates like a pendulum. The further you swing toward artificial light, the more momentum builds for an eventual swing toward unconscious darkness. Your shadow doesn't want to destroy your happiness out of malice. It wants to restore wholeness to your personality, even if its methods seem destructive. The spiritual consequence of this compensation pattern is that you become estranged from your own authentic nature. You're not living from a place of genuine happiness, but from a fearful rejection of your own complexity. This creates a fragile joy that must constantly be defended, rather than a robust fulfillment that can weather life's inevitable storms. Jung discovered that the fourth way your shadow sabotages happiness is through what he termed the repetition compulsion, where you unconsciously recreate scenarios from your past that confirm your deepest fears about happiness. Consider Elena, whose childhood was marked by periods of family harmony, followed by explosive conflicts and emotional chaos. Her parents would create beautiful moments together, but these would inevitably be followed by devastating arguments that left everyone feeling raw and disconnected. As an adult, Elena found herself unconsciously recreating this exact pattern in her romantic relationships. She would work to build beautiful connections with partners, creating moments of genuine intimacy and joy. But just as the relationship began to feel stable and fulfilling, Elena would unconsciously begin to create problems. She might become suddenly critical, pick fights over minor issues, or withdraw emotionally just when closeness felt most possible. Elena wasn't aware that her shadow was running a protective program based on her childhood experience. Her unconscious mind had learned that happiness in relationships was always temporary and always followed by pain. To protect her from the devastation of unexpected loss, her shadow would orchestrate the destruction of happiness on her terms at a time when she felt prepared for it. This repetition compulsion reveals how our shadow often operates as a misguided guardian, trying to protect us from future pain by ensuring we never rise high enough to fall far. The shadow reasons that if you never allow yourself to be truly happy, you'll never have to experience the devastation of losing that happiness. The psychological truth here is that your shadow is not your enemy, but a part of your psyche that hasn't learned that you've grown beyond your childhood circumstances. It's still operating from the protective strategies that may have been necessary when you were young and vulnerable, but which now actively prevent you from accessing the very experiences you most desire. The spiritual cost of this pattern is that you become trapped in what Jung called the eternal return of the same, where your life becomes a repetitive cycle of approaching happiness only to destroy it before it can be fully realized. You remain forever in preparation for a joy that never quite arrives, always finding reasons why this isn't the right time, this isn't the right person, this isn't the right circumstance for lasting fulfillment. The fifth manifestation of shadow sabotage occurs through what Jung identified as negative anima or animus possession, where the unconscious feminine or masculine aspects of your personality become corrupted by shadow energy and begin to undermine your conscious efforts toward happiness. For men, this often appears as a negative anima that whispers poisonous doubts about worthiness, while for women, it might manifest as a destructive animus that attacks any attempt at vulnerability or joy. Consider Robert, a 35-year-old architect who had worked diligently to overcome his childhood wounds and build a life that should have brought him satisfaction. He had a loving partner, meaningful work, and financial stability. Yet Robert found himself plagued by an internal voice that seemed to comment negatively on every positive experience. When he achieved a professional success, the voice would say, "It won't last." When he felt love from his partner, it would whisper, "She'll leave when she really knows you." When he experienced moments of pure joy, it would remind him of all the ways this happiness was fragile or undeserved. This negative anima wasn't just self-doubt, it was his shadow speaking through the feminine aspect of his psyche, which in healthy form should have been a source of intuitive wisdom and emotional connection. Instead, his shadow had corrupted this inner feminine voice, turning it into a saboteur that undermined his every attempt at fulfillment. For women, this often manifests through what Jung called animus possession, where the inner masculine becomes a harsh critic that attacks any display of joy, vulnerability, or satisfaction. Sandra, a talented writer, found that every time she completed a piece of work she was proud of, an internal voice would immediately begin tearing it apart. This wasn't constructive criticism, but a savage attack designed to ensure she never felt genuinely satisfied with her accomplishments. The psychological mechanism here is particularly insidious because it uses your own inner wisdom against you. The anima and animus are meant to be bridges to your unconscious wisdom, sources of creativity, intuition, and balance. When corrupted by shadow energy, they become internal saboteurs that know exactly where to strike to maximum effect. The spiritual consequence of this possession is a profound sense of betrayal by your own psyche. You feel like you can't trust your own thoughts or feelings because the very parts of yourself that should be supporting your growth and happiness have been turned against you. This creates a psychological civil war where your conscious efforts toward joy are constantly undermined by unconscious forces that seem to know all your vulnerabilities. As we delve deeper into understanding these shadow mechanisms, pause for a moment and consider which of these patterns resonates most strongly in your own life. Perhaps you've recognized the happiness ceiling in your own achievements, or noticed how you project your disowned joy onto others only to attack them for it. The very fact that you're watching this video, seeking to understand these patterns, is already a sign that your conscious mind is ready to begin the work of integration, rather than remaining trapped in unconscious sabotage. The sixth way your shadow sabotages happiness operates through what Jung called the sacrifice of the authentic self, where you unconsciously believe that being truly yourself would result in rejection or abandonment, so you maintain personas that keep you safe but fundamentally unfulfilled. This is perhaps the most subtle and pervasive form of self-sabotage because it doesn't feel like sabotage at all. It feels like wisdom, like being realistic about what's possible. Imagine Maria, who discovered early in life that her natural exuberance and emotional intensity made others uncomfortable. Her parents, well-meaning but overwhelmed by their own struggles, consistently asked her to tone it down, to be more reasonable, to consider other people's comfort before expressing her authentic feelings. Over time, Maria learned to compress her natural vitality into a more acceptable package. As an adult, Maria appeared to have everything together. She was liked by colleagues, had stable relationships, and never caused problems for anyone. But beneath this carefully constructed persona, her authentic self was slowly suffocating. Her shadow had convinced her that her real personality was too much, too intense, too risky to reveal. So she lived in a constant state of emotional compression, never allowing herself to experience the full spectrum of joy and aliveness that was her birthright. The cruel irony is that in protecting herself from the imagined rejection that might come from being authentic, Maria was guaranteeing a different kind of rejection, the rejection of her own soul. Her shadow had convinced her that it was safer to be loved for who she was pretending to be than to risk being rejected for who she really was. But this safety came at the cost of ever experiencing genuine happiness, which can only emerge from living in alignment with your authentic nature. Jung understood that this sacrifice of authenticity is one of the shadow's most successful strategies because it feels virtuous. You're being considerate, responsible, mature. You're not causing problems or making anyone uncomfortable. But in reality, you're slowly dying from the inside out, cutting yourself off from the very source of vitality and joy that makes life worth living. The psychological mechanism here reveals how the shadow co-opts our genuine care for others to justify self-betrayal. It whispers that revealing your authentic self would be selfish, that your real feelings are too much for others to handle, that your natural joy might make others feel inadequate or uncomfortable. In this way, the shadow uses your empathy against you, turning your capacity for love into a weapon of self-destruction. The spiritual cost of this authenticity sacrifice is that you become a stranger to yourself. You've spent so much energy maintaining personas that keep others comfortable that you've lost touch with what actually brings you alive. You might achieve external markers of success and even receive love and admiration, but it feels hollow because you know, on some level, that none of it is really for you. It's for the character you've created to navigate the world safely. The seventh and perhaps most devastating way your shadow sabotages happiness is through what Jung called the identification with suffering, where pain becomes so central to your identity that joy actually feels like a threat to your sense of self. This is the deepest level of shadow sabotage because it doesn't just prevent happiness, it makes happiness feel dangerous to your very survival. Consider Thomas, whose childhood was marked by significant trauma and loss. As he navigated these early challenges, Thomas developed an incredible capacity for resilience, depth, and empathy. His ability to understand and hold space for others' pain became a core part of his identity. Friends and family came to rely on his wisdom, his capacity to sit with darkness, his profound understanding of life's difficulties. As Thomas healed and grew, he began to encounter opportunities for genuine joy and lightheartedness. But something strange happened. These moments of happiness felt foreign and threatening. His shadow whispered that if he became too happy, too carefree, he would lose the depth and wisdom that others valued in him. He worried that joy would make him shallow, that healing would cost him his ability to understand others' pain. This reveals the shadow's most sophisticated trap, convincing you that your wounds are your gifts, that your suffering is your strength, that healing would somehow diminish rather than enhance your capacity to serve others and live meaningfully. The shadow creates a false choice between depth and joy, between wisdom and happiness, between being valuable to others and being fulfilled yourself. Jung recognized that this identification with suffering often emerges from genuine spiritual insight corrupted by shadow energy. It's true that our wounds can become sources of wisdom and compassion. It's true that experiencing darkness can deepen our capacity to appreciate light. But the shadow takes these truths and twists them into justifications for remaining trapped in unnecessary pain. The psychological mechanism here operates through what Jung called the inflation of the wounded self, where your ego becomes so attached to the identity of someone who has suffered that healing begins to feel like death. Your shadow convinces you that without your pain, you would have nothing interesting or valuable to offer the world. This is particularly common among individuals who have been through significant healing journeys. Having worked so hard to find meaning in their suffering, they unconsciously resist the very healing they've been seeking because it threatens to fundamentally change how they see themselves and how they relate to others. The spiritual consequence of this pattern is perhaps the most tragic because it prevents you from discovering what Jung called your post-traumatic gifts, the unique capacities that emerge not from remaining wounded, but from transforming your wounds into wisdom. When you identify so strongly with your pain that joy feels like betrayal, you rob the world of seeing what you're capable of becoming when you're fully alive and integrated. But here's where Jung's work offers profound hope. He discovered that the shadow, despite its seemingly destructive nature, is actually trying to serve your wholeness. Every act of self-sabotage, every moment of unconscious destruction, every pattern that keeps you from happiness is your psyche's misguided attempt to protect something it perceives as essential to your survival. The path to stopping your shadow's sabotage doesn't involve destroying or eliminating these parts of yourself. Instead, Jung taught us the revolutionary practice of shadow integration, where you consciously dialogue with these unconscious patterns, understand their protective intentions, and gradually transform them from adversaries into allies. This integration begins with what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites. Instead of fighting your shadow's resistance to happiness, you learn to hold space for both your desire for joy and your fear of it. Instead of judging your self-sabotaging patterns, you approach them with curiosity. What is this part of me trying to protect? What does it need to feel safe enough to allow happiness? When Sarah began working with her happiness ceiling, she didn't try to force herself to maintain success despite her self-sabotage. Instead, she began a dialogue with the part of her that feared sustained joy. She discovered that this part held the memory of her grandmother, who had experienced a devastating loss just after the happiest period of her life. Sarah's shadow had inherited this ancestral fear that joy makes you vulnerable to catastrophic loss. Through patient inner work, Sarah began to honor this protective instinct while also helping it understand that her current circumstances were different from her grandmother's. She created rituals that acknowledged both her desire for happiness and her need for protection. Gradually, her shadow began to relax its vigilant sabotage, allowing her to experience sustained success without the unconscious need to destroy it. Michael's journey with projection required him to reclaim his own capacity for joy by recognizing it in others without attacking it. When he noticed himself becoming critical of someone's happiness, he would pause and ask, "What quality in this person am I refusing to allow in myself?" This practice gradually transformed his projections from weapons of separation into bridges of recognition. David learned to embrace what Jung called the transcendent function, where apparent opposites are held in creative tension rather than forced into false unity. Instead of maintaining artificial positivity or swinging into unconscious negativity, David began to consciously include his full emotional spectrum in his daily experience. He discovered that authentic happiness wasn't the absence of sadness or anger, but the capacity to feel deeply without being overwhelmed by any single emotion. Elena's work with repetition compulsion involved recognizing the difference between past trauma and present possibility. When she noticed herself beginning to sabotage a good relationship, she would pause and ask, "Am I responding to what's actually happening now, or am I defending against a pain that happened then?" This conscious recognition gradually allowed her to respond to present love without the automatic defensive patterns inherited from her past. For Robert and Sandra, working with negative anima and animus possession required what Jung called active imagination, where you consciously dialogue with these inner voices instead of being unconsciously possessed by them. Robert learned to recognize when his negative anima was speaking and would consciously ask, "What are you trying to protect me from?" Often, the voice would reveal legitimate concerns that could be addressed consciously rather than through sabotage. Maria's integration of authenticity sacrifice involved the gradual recognition that she could honor others' comfort without completely abandoning her own nature. She began to experiment with small expressions of her authentic self, discovering that many people actually appreciated her genuine vitality more than her careful personas. Her shadow gradually learned that authenticity didn't automatically result in rejection. Thomas's journey with suffering identification was perhaps the most complex because it required differentiating between genuine depth and attachment to pain. He discovered that true wisdom comes not from remaining wounded, but from transforming wounds into understanding. As he allowed himself to experience more joy, he found that his capacity for empathy actually deepened rather than diminished. Jung's ultimate insight about shadow work was that integration is not a destination, but an ongoing practice. Your shadow will continue to present new challenges as you grow and evolve, but each iteration offers an opportunity for greater wholeness. The goal isn't to eliminate self-sabotage entirely, but to become conscious enough to recognize it when it arises and skillful enough to work with it rather than being controlled by it. The practice of shadow integration requires what Jung called moral courage, the willingness to face aspects of yourself that you'd rather not acknowledge. But this courage is rewarded with something precious, the gradual reclamation of energy that was previously locked in unconscious patterns. Every aspect of your shadow that you consciously integrate becomes available as a resource for creativity, vitality, and authentic happiness. As you begin this work in your own life, remember that the shadow's resistance to happiness is not a flaw in your character, but a testament to the psyche's commitment to wholeness. Your shadow has been faithfully protecting you according to its understanding of what safety requires. The work is not to destroy this protection, but to update its understanding of what you need now, in your current circumstances, with your current capacities. Start small. Notice the moments when happiness feels uncomfortable or when you find yourself unconsciously undermining good things in your life. Instead of judging these patterns, approach them with gentle curiosity. What is this part of you trying to accomplish? What would it need to feel safe enough to allow sustainable joy? Remember that shadow integration is not a solo journey. Jung himself emphasized the importance of relationship in this work, whether through therapy, spiritual direction, or conscious friendship. We discover our blind spots through the mirrors that others provide, and we heal our deepest wounds through the alchemy of conscious connection. The path to sustainable happiness isn't about transcending your humanity, but about embracing it fully. Your shadow contains not only your potential for self-sabotage, but also your rejected gifts, your disowned strengths, your unexpressed creativity. As you learn to dance with these unconscious forces rather than being controlled by them, you discover that true happiness isn't the absence of complexity, but the conscious integration of your full spectrum of being. Jung taught us that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, requires the courage to face everything within yourself with compassion. Your shadow's sabotage of happiness is not evidence that you're broken, but proof that some part of you is so committed to your well-being that it would rather keep you safely miserable than risk unknown joy. But as you develop the skills to dialogue with these unconscious patterns, to understand their protective intentions, and to gradually earn their trust in your ability to handle both joy and sorrow, success and failure, connection and solitude, you discover something remarkable. Happiness becomes not a fragile state that must be defended, but a robust capacity that can weather any storm. This is the promise of Jung's work with the shadow, not the elimination of difficulty, but the development of consciousness capable of transforming any experience into wisdom, any wound into strength, any sabotage into an opportunity for deeper integration. Your shadow will always be with you, but it need not be your master. Instead, it can become your ally in the lifelong journey toward authentic wholeness and sustainable joy. The choice before you now is simple but not easy. Will you continue to allow unconscious patterns to sabotage your happiness? Or will you begin the sacred work of bringing these patterns into consciousness where they can be transformed? The very fact that you've stayed with this exploration until now suggests that some part of you is ready to choose conscious integration over unconscious sabotage. Your happiness is not selfish, it's essential. Not just for your own fulfillment, but for your capacity to serve others from a place of authentic wholeness rather than unconscious woundedness. The world needs people who have done the difficult work of shadow integration, who can hold space for both light and darkness without being overwhelmed by either. As you step forward into this work, remember that every moment of consciousness is a victory. Every recognition of a shadow pattern is progress. Every choice to respond rather than react is a step toward freedom. Your shadow's sabotage of happiness has been a faithful servant to an outdated understanding of what safety requires. Now you have the opportunity to update that understanding, to teach your unconscious that it's safe to be happy, safe to be successful, safe to be authentically yourself. The journey towards sustainable happiness through shadow integration is not about perfection, but about consciousness. Not about eliminating all difficulties, but about responding to them from a place of wholeness rather than fragmentation. In this work, you reclaim not just your capacity for joy, but your birthright as a fully integrated human being, capable of holding the full spectrum of existence with wisdom, compassion, and unshakable inner freedom.